That's me recording. Perfect. Today, we have one of our great postdoctoral scholars, Michael Park, who will be presenting. I'll do a short introduction before the talk. We'll put in the chat some announcements from our YouTube channel that we have from our previous CMHSR seminars that we've recorded, as well as the upcoming CMHSR seminars we have for the month of April and May. So be on the lookout for those emails, and I'll put some of that information in the chat as we go along. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Park. As I mentioned, he's one of our postdoctoral scholars. I've had the privilege of working with Michael over the past almost a year now, Michael. It's been, time flies. So we're very excited to hear his work today. Dr. Park received his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. He's part of our NIMH T32 fellowship here at the Center for Mental Services Research. And his work focuses on the social determinants of mental health and disparities in mental service utilization. Particularly, he's doing great work and studying how Asian American youth internalize racial and ethnic stereotypes, as well as the impact of internalization of mental health in Asian American youth. And he's working towards investigating how patterns of racial stereotypes influence the use of mental health services in this diverse and growing population in the United States. Today, we're gonna hear his talk on racial stereotypes and Asian American youth paradox. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Park, and Michael, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Leo. Let me start sharing the screen. Sorry. There you go. Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. There are lots to cover, so I'll get started right away. So I will show a short video footage without sound, and the video quality might not be great because I intentionally sort of did it because just watching this, some people may experience vicarious racial discrimination. So I tried to, which I did a little bit, but so I tried to minimize that impact as much as possible by blurring some of the images and muting the sound. And if you feel uncomfortable watching this, please look away for a couple seconds. People may have different levels of tolerance. So while watching this, please think about which racial minority group we are seeing here. Okay, so I'm gonna just stop here. So while watching this, can you guess which racial minority group we are talking about here? I mean, I think now it's obvious. It might have been a challenging question if I asked you last year, but we are here talking about Asian Americans in the United States. Now, before I move on, as a disclaimer, I'm not here to sort of promote or advance the idea that one racial minority group suffers more than the other, or just one specific group needs more national attention at this point. But just what I'm really trying to say is each group has a unique racial experience, such as Black youth suffering from police brutality, and Asian American youth has their own unique racial experience, which I'm going to talk more about it today. So as I've shown these images, racially motivated hate crimes initially targeting elders in the Asian community now sort of spread across all generations of Asian Americans. And as we can see from the most recent Atlanta spot shootings, where 6 Asian women, whose age ranging from 33 to 74 were killed. But these sort of anti-Asian hate crimes are not just some random tragic events that just happened one time for them. Although FBI hasn't released their 2020 report yet, according to the Stop AAPI, which collects the data on hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders since the coronavirus pandemic, there were more than 3,500 hate crimes within a year of pandemic. And some may consider maybe this may be due to this unique pandemic situation and Trump's and some other conservatives' attempt to blame China for all of this pandemic situation in the States. But when we go back to the year 2015 and 15 and 16, during the presidential campaign that year, according to the FBI, the hate crimes targeting Asian Americans across the nation grew by more than 20%, which was more than for any other racial groups in the US. But even before that, Asian American youth reported the highest rates of peer harassment perpetrated by both white and other racial minority groups. Now, you may wonder if I'm not here to promote or one group suffers more than the other, then why does this person keep showing the statistics, right? That implies that Asian Americans are disproportionately targeted. And that's because Asian Americans are understudied. For example, the recent JAMA article that shows during the last 30 years, only 0.17% of the NIH funding went to studies on Asian Pacific Islanders. It's 0.17%. But when you look at the US population, the 20 million Asian Americans make up almost 6% of the total US population. And it is projected to reach 14% by year 2065. And then they increase in number by more than 72% from year 2000 to 2015. And they're now becoming the fastest growing groups in the US, surpassing the Latinx Americans in the total number of immigration since 2010. Now, despite this growing presence of Asian Americans in the US, they're understudied and often excluded in discourse around race and racism. So all I'm trying to say here is that Asian Americans are also not exempted from racism, but they receive much less attention from the media and from the literature. So why? Going back to the question is, why Asian Americans, particularly during this challenging period, are becoming the targets of the hate crimes? There may be several theoretical and other reasons for this situation. But according to racial triangulation theory, Asian Americans have been intentionally stereotyped as model minority figure who are hardworking and achievement-oriented, but at the same time, they were stereotyped as forever foreigners who will never be fully accepted as true Americans, regardless of their place of birth or years living in the US. And the theory argues this process of stereotyping Asian Americans in this sort of oppositional manner maintains white privilege and power by situating Asian Americans as the middle person here between the collective Black and the collective white. And this in-between group, including Asian American, is used as a buffer zone to prevent the direct racial conflicts between the collective Black and the collective white by promoting Asian Americans as the model minority figures and thus redirecting this hostility from Blacks towards Asian Americans through the process of othering or ostracizing Asian Americans as the forever foreigners. One study that well captures this situation shows that teachers at school who treated Asian American students as the model minority in class resented other minority students, which led to Asian American students sort of becoming the victims of peer harassment at the school setting. So while theories and studies have shown that the process of othering Asian Americans and praising them as model minorities have created this social climate where Asian Americans became the target of hatredness from other members of the society, I personally was wondering about then what this process really means to Asian Americans. So what does that mean for their lives? So there comes my dissertation project. In the first chapter of my dissertation, I examined how these two stereotypes, including the perpetual foreigner stereotype and the model minority stereotype, together are associated with youth internalizing and externalizing behavior outcomes. Then I examined the interaction effects between these two stereotypes to examine, for example, how the effects of one stereotype depended upon the effects of the others. And lastly, I examined whether this interaction effects between stereotypes further vary by developmental stage, such as by comparing adolescent samples versus emerging adult samples across Filipino American and Korean American groups. And I believe understanding how this population experienced this seemingly oppositional stereotypes and how this experience in turn influenced their development is particularly important for this group. That's because of this mixed patterns of developmental outcomes, what we call the Asian American youth paradox. The paradox is that Asian American young people, and I need to stress that as an aggregate, they report less externalizing behavioral outcomes such as antisocial behaviors, but showing good grades, also reporting more internalizing behavior outcomes such as depressive symptoms, anxieties, and suicidal thoughts. But in the general adolescent populations, problems in one domain often coexist with those in another domain. And there's still debates around whether this is actually the case for Asian American youth, or is this just another stereotype of Asian American children that they are not extrovert or they're having some mental health problems. So some scholars don't really like this terminology. But either case, what I really was trying to do was to understand what factors were predicting fewer externalizing, but more internalizing behavior outcomes with these two oppositional stereotypes. Okay, so now who am I to talk about this topic? So maybe just a little bit about my background. After graduating from college, I worked as a caseworker serving North Korean refugees in South Korea and in China, reselling it to South Korean society. So while working as a caseworker, I witnessed how factors such as their refugee and legal status influence on their physical and mental health outcomes. So I started paying attention to struggles that individuals are facing while they're transitioning into another society. And after I came to Chicago, I started my master's and PhD program at the School of Social Work. I started working as a youth development staff at immigrant serving agencies, an Asian American mental health clinic, and had my firsthand experience of how immigrant youth are struggling where they're trying to fit into American society. And this experiences led me to participate in the Midwest longitudinal study of Asian Americans Family Project, which is the three-wave longitudinal survey of Filipino and Korean American families in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. And my dissertation project that I'm sharing today is based on this data from this project. But before, I will share several projects that led me to conceptualize my dissertation study. The research agenda during my predoctoral training was first to investigating the longitudinal trajectories of mental health outcomes and their predictors. And after identifying racial discrimination as one of the most salient predictors, I tried to find factors that may protect Asian American children from the racial harm. Now, I wasn't quite satisfied with the single-dimensional aspects of perceived racial discrimination measure that our project was using. So that's why I did my dissertation project where I examined this multiple racial stereotypes. Specifically, my early work has been on examining the prevalence of mental health outcomes among Asian American children transitioning to emerging adulthood. And studies on Asian American mental health are often based on cross-sectional data. So we don't really know much about how their mental health outcomes change as they get older. So with this longitudinal data set, we first examine the longitudinal patterns of mental health outcomes. And what we found was that first, the mental health distress, including depressive symptoms and suicidal thoughts, significantly increased over the 4-year study period from 2014 and 2018. For example, the rate of suicidal thoughts at wave 1 was 10%, and it increased to 13 at wave 2, and by the time wave 3, it reached to 16%. So within this 4-year time period, the suicidal thoughts increased by 60%. Now the question was, what are the predictors of these mental health outcomes? So we have examined a cluster of predictors, including parent-child relationships, including like parent-child conflict, parent-child bondings, and also several family processes measures. And what we found was that one of the factors that remain significant even after we accounting for all of these factors together was the experience of racial discrimination. So I got into more interested in how we could protect Asian American children when they experience racial discrimination. So we examined protective factors such as social support and racial socialization practices and how their protective effects differ by social positions, such as ethnicity, gender, and place of birth. For example, we examined the protective effects of racial socialization practices within the family that they're intended to prepare minority children to deal with racism. Now, the literature on this field is mixed. Some found, for example, the protective effects of just talking about race and racism at home with their parents, but others found no such positive effect. And what we hypothesized was that it may be due to the fact that we haven't paid much attention to some of the important social positions of Asian American youth. And indeed, what we found was that the effects of racial socialization practices differ by ethnic backgrounds as well as youth place of birth. And while my previous studies examined this negative impact of racial discrimination, my dissertation is more about understanding the impacts of multidimensional challenges faced by Asian Americans as the minority group. And as I introduced at the beginning, one of the most cited theories explaining this complex process is racial triangulation theory. And it argues that racial stereotypes of Asian Americans have prevented Asian Americans from sort of advancing their social status or general well-being. And these two stereotypes include model minority stereotypes and perpetual foreigner stereotypes. And more specifically, perpetual foreigner stereotype, which can be traced back to early 1800s. It refers to an assumption that Asian Americans are forever foreigners. They're incapable of being fully Americans, regardless of their citizen status, or how long they stay in the United States. And a good example of that is Asian Americans being asked about their nationality, such as by being asked, where are you really from? Or being praised about their English, despite the fact that they were born here and they're native English speaker. While there are few, if any, studies out there examining the effects of perpetual foreigner stereotypes on externalizing behavior outcomes, the literature has shown that perpetual foreigner stereotype is negative on internalizing behavior outcomes, including depressive symptoms and negative effect. On the other hand, model minority stereotype, which could be also traced back to, this practice could be also traced back to 1800s, became much more popular during the civil rights era in the 1960s, when Asian Americans became much more popular tool to blame other minority groups for their lower socioeconomic status, and in particular Blacks through the popular framework of cultural poverty, model minority stereotype is built on the idea that Asian Americans are an exemplary racial minority group who have achieved their success through their own individual efforts. While the effects of perpetual foreigner stereotype is generally straightforward, studies have found model minority stereotype to be mixed. So for example, some found it to predict more psychological distress, while others found it to be positive. And others found more complicated story. For example, Dr. Brandon Yu, who created the internalization of the model minority myth measure in 2010, who is also one of my dissertation committee member, found this differential effects of model minority stereotype by its subdomains, which includes the model minority myth of achievement orientation with the stereotypes of Asian Americans being hardworking and achievement oriented, and the model minority stereotype of unrestricted mobility, that the Asian Americans not facing any sort of socioeconomic barriers while they're moving up the social ladder. And specifically, they found model minority stereotype of achievement-oriented to be negative on academic expectation stress, while model minority stereotype of unrestricted mobility to have a positive effect. So in other words, Asian American students who believed that their ethnic group's success was based upon their own efforts, such as by working harder, were more likely to experience stress related to academic expectations, but the beliefs in unrestricted mobility seems to lower this stress. And although the racial triangulation theory that I introduced multiple times now argues that these two stereotypes together shape the racial experience of Asian Americans, none of these previous studies that I introduced have examined the effects of both stereotypes together. And I was so curious because most of the studies that examine this individual effects of racial stereotype do cite racial triangulation theory and argues that they need to consider both stereotypes together to better understand their racial experiences. But then they go on and just examine the effects of one stereotype. So at the conference, I met Dr. Brandon Yu for the first time, who studies model minority stereotype, but also whose advisor studies perpetual foreigner stereotype. So I asked him, and I wanted to double check with him because I was wondering whether there's any reason why people aren't just doing both together. And it turned out no one has done this yet, which was a good news for me. And he said it may be in part due to the tendency of people focusing on their own line of research. For example, those who studies model minorities study like him would generally focus on that and vice versa. So that's why I decided to do this as my dissertation project. To pursue these research questions of mine, I used the data from ML South project, which I introduced briefly at the beginning. But this study is very rare longitudinal data set on Asian American children, especially transitioning to emerging adulthood. As I mentioned, there has been only 0.17% of fundings went towards the studies of Asian Americans. And this study is literally just one of them. And this study is unique in a sense that studies on Asian American children are mostly from the West Coast or East Coast, but not much from the Midwestern area. And despite the fact that Midwestern Asian Americans, they reported the highest rates of microaggressions. Also in survey research, Asian Americans are often treated as a monolithic group, partially because of the limited sample size, despite the huge differences among Asian American subgroups. For this study, we specifically chose Filipino Americans and Korean American subgroups to account for these subgroup differences. And we chose these two groups not just because they are the third and fifth largest Asian American subgroups in the United States, but these subgroups share some similarities, but also different in other important ways. For example, the subgroups are similar in their socioeconomic status, and that they are mostly from the middle class, but Filipino American and Korean Americans are notably different in their racialized experiences, in their home country as well as in the host society. For example, the Philippines had a prolonged colonization by the US, and in the South Korea, the US involvement significantly increased after the Korean War in 1950s. And in the States, Filipino Americans are often mistaken for Latinx Americans because of their shared experience of Spanish colonizations, because of their darker phenotypes compared to other East Asians. So their racialized experiences have been similar to some of the Latinx Americans in some ways. And in contrast, the racial experiences of Korean Americans are typical of what racial triangulation theory has depicted. So they're quite different in their racialized experiences, but we don't know much about how these two groups are experiencing these racial stereotypes. So that's why we decided to choose these two specific groups. And this data set has both parent and child diet samples, so we could compare children's responses with their parents. Now, a little bit about this data set. The first wave was collected in 2014, and the retention rate for the second wave in 2016 was more than 74%. And actually, the retention rate went up at wave 3. And now we are in the process of collecting wave 4 data through the additional funding from Russell Sage Foundation. And I'm now part of this team as a consultant. And my dissertation, which is based on wave 3 data set, because the stereotype measures were only included at wave 3. And I asked my PI specifically to include these measures for my dissertation project. And at wave 3, 47% of Filipino American and 39% of Korean Americans were emerging adults, meaning they were 18 and above. And more than half of youth were foreign born, and gender distribution among children were about equal. Now to measure, I might have to just skip this part. To measure how Asian American youth internalize model minority stereotype, I used the model minority myth of measure, and also to measure the awareness of perpetual foreigner stereotype, we use this specific measure from Dr. Han. Internalizing behavior outcomes included positive and negative effect and depressive symptoms and suicidal thoughts. And externalizing behavior outcomes included non-suicidal self-injury, antisocial behaviors, including minor assault, felony assault and delinquency, and illegal substance use. Now, I know people may not feel comfortable putting non-suicidal self-injury and substance use under this externalizing behavior outcomes, but some studies have found that youth engage in this sort of behaviors to externalize their inner stress, and they are significantly related with other traditionally recognized externalizing behaviors, such as antisocial behaviors. So in this study, for simplicity, we categorize these two as part of the externalizing behavior outcomes. To investigate these research questions, I ran hierarchical regression analysis. In the first step, I included demographic characteristics and 3 racial stereotype measures. And in the second step, we additionally included interaction terms. And then in the third step, we included 3 interaction terms to examine whether these moderating effects that we will identify in step 2 are different across developmental stage. Now the fun part. So what we found in the direct effect model was, as sort of expected, awareness of perpetual foreigner stereotype predicted more internalizing behavior outcomes among both ethnic groups. Expected, specifically, this awareness of perpetual foreigner stereotype predicted higher rates of negative affect, depressive symptoms, and suicidal thoughts. But none of the subdomains of internalized model minority stereotype was related to youth outcomes. But once we examined this interaction effects between perpetual foreigner stereotypes and model minority stereotypes, we found that the similarly positive stereotypes of model minority stereotypes of achievement actually worsened the negative impact of perpetual foreigner stereotype, particularly among Korean American subgroups. But we also found model minority stereotypes of unrestricted mobility to be protective on internalizing behavior outcomes, of which findings were sort of consistent with prior studies. We also found significant interaction effects between two subdomains of model minority stereotype in both positive and negative ways. That is, when the rates of both subdomains of model minority stereotype were high, they had a protective effect on externalizing behavior outcomes, such as by preventing it from conducting non-suicidal self-injury and illegal substance use, but a negative effect on internalizing behavior outcomes. Now, I wanted to get more nuanced understanding of these mechanisms that underlying the relations between racial stereotypes and behavior outcomes. So I also examined how these factors may vary by developmental stage. And what we found was that interaction effects became more prominent or sort of became more significant during emerging adults. Specifically for Filipino American samples, model minority stereotype of unrestricted mobility, which wasn't significant in previous models, became protective on internalizing behavior outcomes among emerging adults. But for Korean American samples, the harmful effects of model minority stereotype of unrestricted of achievement were only identified among emerging adults, but not among adolescent groups. Now, summary, we found that racial stereotypes may be able to explain the mechanisms that is contributing to Asian American youth paradox. That is, we found that perpetual foreigner stereotypes was extensively predictive of internalizing behavior outcomes, regardless of ethnic backgrounds. And we also found that among Korean American groups, model minority stereotype, while increasing internalizing behavior outcomes, also suppressed youth from externalizing their behaviors. And among Filipino American group, model minority stereotype of unrestricted mobility was actually protective when they were highly aware of perpetual foreigner stereotypes. And it may be the case that for Filipino American youth who sometimes do not fit quite well in the model minority category compared to other East Asian subgroups, internalizing this positive stereotype of having unrestricted mobility may be potentially beneficial to Filipino American youth. But on the other hand, for Korean American youth, who has been consistently depicted as the model minority figure as part of the East Asian subgroups, and having already higher expectations on themselves from others, so internalizing this model minority stereotype may not be healthy for them. And more importantly, we also found that this interaction effects became more prominent during the emerging adulthood period. Many Asian American students in high school have been told that they should be academically successful and behave well because they are Asian Americans. But after they went to college, and this is something that I learned from the focus group with the college students, and after they went to college or they went to the workplace, they may have realized that they were in fact being marginalized in white dominant campus or workplaces, where just being a good student or working hard will not lead to the same success that their white counterparts could achieve with the similar levels of effort and qualifications. So this concurrent effects of racial stereotypes may have become more salient during emerging adults, as the current study has shown. There are several important implications of this study, but I believe the most important one is that we should inform frontline clinicians as well as school staff about the negative impact of these two racial stereotypes, and especially the similarly positive stereotype of model minority stereotype, and how it varies by ethnic background and developmental stage. Several studies have already sort of showed that it is actually the school staff who are perpetuating this model minority stereotype at the school. And my study shows this, even this seemingly positive one, such as by stereotyping as hardworking and achievement-oriented, could be detrimental to their mental health outcomes as well. Now, based on my previous research findings, I'm trying to expand my dissertation study into 3 separate projects during this period. First, I wanted to extend my current research to longitudinal study. One of the most important findings that I found was that this concurrent and negative effects of racial stereotypes became more prominent during emerging adulthood. which warrant further investigation with the longitudinal data, because this is just cross-sectional data set. We can't really have any causal argument with this. So once we finish collecting this fourth phase of MLSOP data, I want to pursue this longitudinal study. Also, I'm also planning to examine the intersections of race and gender by additionally adding this racialized gender stereotypes into the current stereotype project. It is very important to examine the intersections of race and gender because of this unique racialized experiences of Asian American youth by gender. That is, Asian American males and females are stereotyped as lacking masculinity and being hyper-feminine, respectively. And the most recent Atlanta spa shootings exemplify these hypersexualized stereotypes of Asian American women. But we haven't really comprehensively examined these multiple effects of stereotypes. Luckily, I was able to include these measures into the fourth wave survey. So I'm super excited to see how this will predict youth developmental outcomes. I also want to examine how the family context, such as parental experiences as racial minorities in the US, influence on their children's internalization of racial stereotypes. Studies have shown the importance of family context in child development, but there hasn't been much studies on how familial context shapes the patterns of internalized racial stereotypes. So with the available MLSOP data set, with the parent and child family diet samples, I'm planning to explore this research question as well. And once I have better understanding of the mechanisms between these racial stereotypes and the mental health outcomes, I want to develop or modify existing interventions to alleviate the harmful effects of racial stereotypes on the mental health of Asian American youth. Thank you so much for listening my talk. Now, if you have any questions, yeah, please let me know.
Excellent, Michael. Thank you so much for a great presentation. And as I mentioned in the chat, people can either unmute or just share your questions in the chat, and I'll help moderate the discussion. You mind stop sharing, Michael?
Oh, okay, yeah.
That way it's a little bit better to see everyone. Oh, perfect. So any questions, yeah, in terms of where we're at? So, Michael, I do have a question. I think some of this work is really beginning to, continuing to address this issue of multiple racial sort of stereotypes that we have. And I think your work is really trying to disentangle the multiple levels of racial stereotype and discrimination that happens. And not only that, but trying to disaggregate that within Asian populations. So the Filipino versus Korean and this level. So can you talk a little bit more about that, the racial socialization across these two groups for children and adolescents, in a sense, and young adults, how families are dealing with this? And this seems to be a continuous, sadly enough, a continuous moving target as we're helping our young people understand what's happening in our world, but also how to cope in healthy manners, particularly for their health and their mental health, in terms of family practices, family approaches for that. And your work can really help us begin to address some of those things, in a sense. Yeah.
Right. So the racial socialization practice. So so this paper just got accepted like a couple of weeks ago. But what we really did was examining their multiple socialization practices within the family. There are the major three different types: preparation for bias, which is, like I said, discussing about the racism and prepare their children about what's going to come. And then there's a promotion of mistrust that sort of, it's the literature have shown there's a debate whether it's positive or negative. I mean, it's a negative one because it's trying to promote the distrust, that we have to be careful, or we have to mistrust or distance ourselves from other people. Like, for example, if your parents experienced hate crimes from certain racial minority group, then you might say to your parent, your children that you have to avoid certain racial groups, which isn't healthy in general. But what we found was that for Filipino American group, this promotion of mistrust was protective. And we reported that. I mean, and there was studies out there that showed this pattern, that promotion of mistrust were protective when children were experiencing high rates of racial discrimination. And we understood that because like when you are experiencing high rates of racial discrimination, as a parent, your child's safe is the most important thing. But at the same time, we have to be cautious because we also check that when the racial discrimination is not high, when youth doesn't experience high rates of racial discrimination, it had a just pure negative effect on their mental health. It increased your depressive symptoms, it increased your suicidal thoughts. I mean, it was protective when youth experience high rates of discrimination. So this is the caveat. We have to think about how these different types of socialization practices are playing differently under different situations. But for Korean Americans, what we found was that preparation for bias, having discussions at home, educating their children about these negative experiences and why is the cause, was protective, regardless of other factors.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's a question here from Gretchen. Gretchen, you mind asking it if you want, if you can unmute? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah. Michael, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the focus groups and just tell us a little more specifics. If you had like one focus group for Korean American youth versus Filipino, or how, just kind of how you did all that.
So I have to admit that this focus group, we did it, but we didn't really report anything. It was just to prepare for the second wave. So the first wave, we didn't have emerging adults, meaning those who are 18 and above. We started with the samples of age between 12 and 17, or in high schools or middle schools. And we wanted to be prepared, right? We wanted to be better prepared with our survey to include some of the questionnaires that are tailored towards the experience of emerging adults. So we did focus group with the college students here in Chicago. With some of the university, we recruited, we didn't have any specific ethnic groups, but we were able to recruit some diverse ethnic groups in the public schools as well as some private schools to capture diverse socioeconomic status. So yeah, that's what we did. And some of the things I was sharing was incorporated in my presentations, but I really didn't identify it as a studies out of focus group because it was just informative focus group study.
Okay,
so
that makes sense.
To be prepared for the actual survey, yeah.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. It's a really important topic.
Thanks.
And we have a question here from Calvin Lay. You mind unmuting yourself and asking it? It's a really cool, really interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi,
Michael.
Hi, Kevin.
So the really interesting data, and I guess the question that I have is like, where do these individual differences come from, right? Why, a lot of times when we think about these stereotypes, we're talking about how they're just in the air and we're all aware of them. But you're not quite studying that. You're studying individual differences. Some Korean and Filipino Americans believe it more and some believe it less. But where did that come from, right? Why is there this variation? And I'm wondering what kind of traction you've had on figuring that out. Like, why do they vary in the first place?
So that's a very good question. And that's another project that I want to do, because like what is predicting that internalized racial stereotypes? But just the preliminary findings that I have found so far. And I'm always interested in how, for example, place of birth or gender, nativity, I mean, that's the place of birth, how that influences on their sense of racial stereotypes. And what we found was that nativity sort of explained a little bit about the differences in terms of how they internalize stereotypes. For example, foreign-born were more likely to internalize or the experience or aware of perpetual foreigner stereotypes. But in terms of the model minority stereotype, we didn't have much difference across nativity. but these are some of the things that I want to identify, so I could target as the later as the intervention points.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
So he's my part of the mentoring team. So.
Dr. Lay, good to meet you. So I think one of the things that is really powerful of the data set is being able not only to do it as you're done, sort of developmental stage, but by gender as well. That's sort of a next step here, like, because there are sort of these nuanced differences within these groups, which are very diverse and group, but beginning to identify some of that and try to pinpoint some of this element. I think it's really important.
And I wanted to respond to that, because we did examine how, for example, with the socialization paper, how the racial socialization differs by gender, and also how the negative impact of racial discrimination differs by gender. And I mean, the literature out there shows, the meta-analysis showed that there's no gender difference.
Interesting.
In terms of the impact of discriminations on their mental health.
At the adolescent, in adolescent?
At adolescent.
I see.
So that's what we found with the racial socialization paper. We couldn't find gender difference in terms of the impact of racial discriminations.
I see.
And also for this paper, we couldn't really find much in terms of the gender difference. But that's, I mean, gender difference is out there, because like what I shared, there's a gender-based racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
So I think we can't capture this with just this generalized measures, but I think we should really specify and have this gender-based specific racial stereotype measure to better capture their experiences. So that's what we're aiming for.
I have a question here from Jennifer. I don't see her on the chat. Oh, Jennifer. Yeah, there we go. Jennifer, you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question? This is actually very interesting.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Jen. I'm actually joining from the East Coast, Colombia, and this is really exciting. And I just want to say, Dr. Park, thank you so much for the study. As a Korean American, I really appreciate. I think you sort of answered my second question, but the first question was if there's any known influence of sibling relationships on the outcomes apart from family as a whole, parents, or even peer relationships, which I think was controlled for earlier in the slides. And if you have any other thoughts, specifically, my second question was around the influence of duration of living in the US for foreign-born folks.
So that's a very, very good question. But first of all, about the sibling, I have no idea. I mean, I believe it's very important. And I think it's something we need to really study, the orders of siblings. But that's something that I really hadn't much experience with. So I can't really respond to that. We only have one child within this data set, one parent and one child. So we couldn't really examine that, as well as I wasn't able to have much experience with that. But in terms of the peers, I think the peer is very important experience, and its effects are becoming more significant over time. And you could check the paper that I worked on in 2020, how the peer effects change over time. So I could share with that. But currently another project that I'm doing is I'm examining how dispositional characteristics of youth are influencing on their mental health outcomes. And what we found was that peers are helping in terms of their mental health. So having a positive relationship with their peers are protective in their mental health outcomes. It's when they have like sort of negative effect, this negative effect is being alleviated. So, and this is coming out from the longitudinal data set. And but on the other hand, when youth have a positive peer relations, then it's sort of having some negative impacts on their externalizing behaviors. They're more likely to engage with some antisocial behaviors, things like that. And this is some of the puzzles that I had for a long time, because the ethnic identity, for example, is positive on ethnic identities of Asian Americans have been identified as positive on their mental health, but it also increased externalizing behavior outcomes like gang involvement, things like that. And I think having this link of how peer works in oppositional manners in terms of the internalizing versus externalizing behavior outcomes, I think that's very important to further explore. And I'm sorry, what was the last question?
The other question was around the influence of how long one lived in the US.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was one of my research interests during the early years in predoctoral training. I was so fascinated by the years living in the US and how that influences on their mental health. But there is definitely like a dosage effect. When it gets at certain point, it becomes very significant. But then when you account the nativity, at least for my understanding, that effect disappears. So I found this nativity is capturing more than this years living in the US. But I think these two are overlapped, but at the same time are measuring some different aspects. So I think both are very important. And there's lots of literature out there that explores how the years of living in the US versus just place of birth, or how the length of time, comparing that. I think it's still areas that we are trying to figure out what are the right. I'm sorry, I don't think I really answered to that point.
No, it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you for those questions. And Michael, I think that this is informing. I think I know part of the work here is try to inform going towards interventions and really thinking about what a proactive, healthy racial socialization within the family and with peers among this population. I think your findings are beginning to identify some potential mechanisms to target and to really think through as you're doing that. I guess the one question that I've had, and I know this is where you're jumping in the next stage of this work, is you've looked at this impact on mental health outcomes, depression, internalizing behavior, but there's also something here for service use.
Exactly,
how the stereotypes impact people's seeking help or using services for depression. And so can you talk a little bit about sort of that time as you move into that? Yeah.
Yes. So the literature have started to show that the model minority stereotype predicted more barriers in help seeking. If they internalize the model minority stereotype, they're less likely to seek out for help because they internalize this model minority sense, and they don't want to show that they're weakness. And that's something that I want to explore with my youth data set as well. So we included that measure. We didn't have that health service use and health seeking behaviors with the youth data. So we included that wave 4 and wave 4 data set. So we'll be able to see how the stereotypes together influences on their health seeking as well as mental health service use. But with the preliminary findings with the parent data was that there was a significant correlation with the model minority stereotype and barriers to help seeking behaviors, but not with the service use itself.
Got it. In controlling, accounting for other things. Oh, that's really interesting. So other questions from the group? I see, looking at the chat here.
This may not be a 3-minute question, Michael, so I apologize for this one and apologize also if it's too sort of broad to answer on the spot. You've probably seen this request for information from NIH inviting comments and suggestions to, I'm reading the whole thing, advance and strengthen racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in biomedical research workforce and advance health disparities and health equity research. And I'm struck by that 0.17% figure that you mentioned. And I just wonder if you have any suggestions or like immediate, if you ruled the world and had to respond to or were responding to this RFI, what kind of things would you mention to increase focus on this area and really make some headway in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, very important question. I think I talked with Leo about this, but what I really trying to do now is I want to get involved with the NIH review process as I move forward. Because I think there needs to be people who understand this study and who could really examine the values of this research. I'm not saying all Asian American studies should be funded, but within the Asian American study, those who are really having a values to add, they should be fairly evaluated. And I've had a conversation with I think I pretty much know all the scholars who got funded, with Asian American scholars in the States, because we had this meeting. We invited all the scholars who got funded to our with the MLSoft project meeting, and they shared a lot of experiences in terms of getting not funded extendedly. Our study wasn't funded as well, and we tried to find with different routes by using Russell Sage Foundation, but that's something I think we need to diversify the review process at the NIH as well.
And there's been there's a initiative, as I mentioned to you and Michael, and for the rest, it's called the NIH First, which is really beginning to expand now, and not only looking at funding, but structures from the review process to the workforce, to representation of more diverse representation in review committees, to understanding different things. So there is a movement now, Byron. We'll see how it evolves. There was a new call, U01 call for transformative research in health disparities, and it's really the U01 mechanism is more like an involved contract rather than an R01 mechanism. And I think the RFA is indicating that they're putting forward $24 million within that initiative over the next couple of years. So I think there's a really interesting discussion now, and hopefully NIH is moving, because it is very shocking. It's not surprising, Michael. I'm sad to say it's not surprising, but it's shocking to see when you break the percentages of what's actually being funded by different groups and I think and I know there's, at least in NIMH and in other institutes that I'm involved in, that they're really digging deep into the data and saying, what can we do? And I think there's opportunities on a pot of skull. We need to engage with our funders and provide education and participate in this type of things. I think it's very important. So I know we're running out of time. I put in the chat our next CMHSR talk on April 28th. Kelly Ashburner from Dartmouth will be presenting the brand new results of her peer group lifestyle intervention enhanced with mobile health for young adults with serious mental illness. And Kelly's is a good colleague, our fellow social worker, actually, that has run this trial, and she's looking forward to present, and we're looking forward to having her here in our seminar. So thank you so much for your presentation, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for your time today, and have a good rest of your day today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.